Okay. You're live now. Yep.
Which link should I send to my friend?
Yeah, that link you can send. No, just send the 1 minute. Let me share the 1 minute. Hold on. Tag. Can I share it to you? And that way you could share on a friend's profile.
Because he's trying to get into Facebook, but apparently it's coming in Kannada. So he asked me if he could get a link so that he can click on it and then watch it.
Facebook is not. Yeah, just share my. If you go to my profile, you will see the video is online. Share it with him.
My profile. So.
You will see the video is online. Share it with him.
So I click this and then share this link, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Just on the video மட்டும் mute Facebook feedல இருக்கிற video mute.
And then share this link, right? Yeah, that's it. So shall I mute the Facebook so that?
Yeah. You can mute the video. Just click the video audio microphone in the video there, and you'll be good.
Now it's okay, right?
Yeah, now you're perfectly okay. Let's just give it a minute.
We interact through StreamYard.
Yeah. So, you get all the comments here.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm ready, Arvind. I can.
So, there you go. Let's give 5 minutes or something like that, so it's slowly picking up. Once we have a few more, we'll start. And I can bring on the questions here. That's not a problem. Let me go ahead and share the screen thing too. So was Dilip able to join?
Yeah, I'll just call check him.
Okay.
Hello. Hi, Dilip. I sent you a link. Are you able to join? Okay, great. Okay. Yeah. Okay, we'll start in a few minutes. Yeah. Yeah. Aravind is watching.
Oh, okay, cool. Let's get started. Yeah, I think we got some people online, and let's get started.
Yeah.
Sure. All right, so
Hello?
Friends,
One
can we,
minute.
can we go ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go. Friends, happy to join with you for another time with my good friend Gopi Ratnaraj from University of Illinois, currently working at University of Atria for a very good topic about, this is a follow-on from what we did a few weeks ago. And that was about the legacy of nuclear energy and its legacy and its future. Now we are taking the other side of nuclear aspect, which is the weapons. Right? So the first introduction of mankind to nuclear age, as we call it, is through the Hiroshima bombing. So essentially, we came to know about the potential of the nuclear age via the weapon first before we knew how to tame it and generate energy. And with that backdrop, we are just going to have a quick overview of the birth of the Manhattan Project. Contrary to popular opinion, Albert Einstein was not really on board at first with the idea of fission and generating a bomb. It was brought to him primarily by a scientist called Leo Szilard, an immigrant from Hungary. And he convinced Einstein that chain reaction can be done and it could be weaponized. And they wanted to get this message to Franklin Roosevelt, primarily because this was a group of scientists who immigrated. All of them were Jewish. They had emigrated from primarily Germany and Hungary and running away from the Nazi regime. And their idea in taking it to Roosevelt was to tell the Allies you could develop a bomb. And there was also a fear element to this. Many of them feared that key scientists of the quantum physics era, notably Heisenberg, was working in the Nazi regime. So they knew that some effort towards an atom bomb will be made by Hitler, and they wanted the Allies to have their own bomb, probably before Hitler does. So there was a race here. And they wanted to get the attention of Roosevelt, and they knew that the one name that can accomplish that was Albert Einstein, who had by then emigrated to the US, was working at Princeton Institute of Advanced Studies. He practically had anybody's ear he wanted. So Leo Szilard, in this photo of Leo sitting with Albert Einstein, is actually a recreated photo. And they recreated that moment where Szilard is helping Einstein to draft the letter to Franklin Roosevelt. August 2nd, the letter was drafted. It takes nearly 2 months for a personal friend of the president, Alexander Sachs, to meet FDR and to give him the letter. And the letter has its immediate effect within a week. Imagine this, right? This is Franklin Roosevelt. The World War II is going on, and within a week, he's replying back to Einstein saying, "We are going to do this." That was the effect Einstein's letter had on Roosevelt. So that gamble of using Einstein paid off. And who were these? There's an interesting story about these immigrants from Hungary. Hungary was a country when it was run over by Nazi Germany. Practically by the end of the war, more than half of the pre-war Jewish people were killed. So all these scientists ran for their lives from Hungary, and they were interestingly called. There was this thing about do Martians exist? That was a debate at that time, and somebody made this quick about the Hungarian scientists being the Martians. And which is what Isaac Asimov said. There is a rumor in America that there are two intelligent races on Earth, humans and Hungarians. And that included Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, who will go on to become the inventor of the hydrogen bomb, also win a Nobel Prize, and Paul Erdos and Eugene Wigner was another key figure, and then von Neumann. So some of these people came after their prime also. Like Einstein didn't do much great work after he came here. Nevertheless, the project was kicked off. The Manhattan Project starts, and the first test was done on July 16th, 1945, and that was the photograph from that test. And that is when Robert Oppenheimer, another brilliant scientist, went on to quote very famously the Bhagavad Gita, where he said, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of the worlds." And Robert Oppenheimer had a very checkered career. He was suspected of communist sympathies. He ran into trouble with the American establishment later. And July 16th, 1945 was the successful test. And at the Potsdam meeting, I think it was Truman at that time, because by the time FDR had died, and Truman tells Stalin that they have a huge bomb that will make a big impact without actually telling what the bomb is. And on August 6th, Hiroshima was bombed. August 9th was Nagasaki. And less than a week later, Japan surrendered. There are always questions about why America chose to bomb instead of just demonstrating it. I will just sum it up in a couple of lines, right? After Hitler's death, Japan refused to surrender. The Pacific War continued. The Battle of Iwo Jima told the American establishment that Japan will fight to the last man and will not surrender, and the human cost, particularly to American lives, will be a lot, and the Allies. There was a complex calculation of Soviet Russia trying to enter into the Pacific War. And all of that put together, the decision for Truman was, I would say, simple enough. And true enough, the war immediately came to an end. So with that dawned the nuclear atom bomb and the nuclear era from the weapon perspective. As of May 19th, this is a database from Federation of American Scientists. This tells you that there are 6,500 nuclear warheads in Russia. America has got 6,185, and you could see China has close to 290. India has 140, Pakistan a little more at 150. So essentially, we now live in a world where there is considerable nuclear arsenal, and a nuclear war, as much as we think is a remote possibility, it still remains a distinct possibility. And of course, most of us here are from the subcontinent, and we have a interest in what goes on, particularly between the nuclear armed rivalry, the nuclear armed rivals of India and Pakistan. So with this backdrop, right, I would like my friend to take over from here and walk us through the legacy of the nuclear weapons, the arsenals. Where are we in a strategic perspective? What does the future hold for us? Welcome to the show, Gopi.
Thank you, Aravind. Can you see this? Have I shared this?
Share your screen, Gopi.
1 second.
Sorry, and we did the thing again.
I'm able to see now. 1 second.
Yep, it's coming. You need to minimize your windows and put, yep, there you go. No.
1 second.
Do this presentation. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. You're able to see now?
Yeah, we are good.
Okay, great. Thank you, Aravind. Good to meet the audience live again after three or 4 weeks. The first part of the presentation, or the first part of my talk that I gave, was on the legacy and future of nuclear energy as a source of clean, carbon-free electricity. That was done 3 weeks back. And when I spoke to Aravind about continuing this in a part 2 discussion focusing on nuclear weapons, he happily agreed to moderate it. And so we are here now. So I will, like last time, what I plan to do is to give a 20 to 25 minute presentation laying out the primary issues surrounding nuclear weapons. And
just a minute,
yes.
Right? If you can increase your volume a little bit more.
1 second.
Just your speaking volume.
Is it okay now?
Yeah, that's better. Yeah.
Okay. So the idea is to present the issues in 20 or 25 minutes and then open it for discussion. I don't have to continue the issues that was already covered by Arvind in his prefatory remarks, so I will skip some of that, but in the interest of time. As Arvind mentioned, it was the starting point for this discussion is Leo Szilad's persuasion of Einstein to write that famous letter to President Roosevelt. Arvind, can you, is the slide visible now?
Yeah. Slide is visible. You just proceed.
Okay. And in 1939, the letter was drafted by Leo Szilard and Einstein and was sent to President Roosevelt. And the Manhattan Project was initiated, which was perhaps the largest mobilization of scientific and technical manpower with the single objective of making a nuclear weapon, a usable nuclear weapon, before Nazi Germany did. The reason was there was a fear that Germany would also be able to produce nuclear weapons because they had scientists who were working on the problem. But Nazi Germany failed on account of various reasons: internal struggles, scientific error, and devastation caused by the total war really distracted the Nazi nuclear effort, which resulted in US having the primacy of nuclear weapons. The US nuclear program was perhaps the most secretive. In fact, even the then vice president, was not aware of the program. It was General Leslie Groves, who from the US Army Corps of the Manhattan Engineer District, who was appointed to direct the project. Oppenheimer was the scientific director. And his role was to identify the top scientists who were available, working in various labs across American universities, and of course tapping the Jewish talent that was that had migrated from various European countries. Enrico Fermi, who had migrated from Italy, was managing the University of Chicago metallurgical project, where the goal was to produce a self-sustaining chain reaction, or the prototype of a self-sustaining nuclear reactor. So the goal, it was codenamed as the Chicago Pile, and the goal of the Chicago Pile was to produce plutonium, which is a weapons usable material. And Fermi and his colleagues achieved the first controlled fission reaction in 1942, which greatly enabled them to scale up the production of uranium in Hanford, Washington. And parallelly, the US was also working on a separate project to separate the rare isotope of uranium, which is U-235, which could also be used as a weapons material. So the US had two parallel tracks for its nuclear weapons program: one, the plutonium-based weapon, and the uranium-based weapon. And Los Alamos was the hub of the US nuclear weapons project. The Los Alamos team was the one which designed and fabricated the two bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th, 1945. And another one was tested in July 1945, the Trinity test. So the World War II ended in Europe, but it dragged in the Pacific. So with Japan, as Arvind mentioned, was very determined to fight till the last man, and it was a war of desperation. And it was the dropping of the nuclear weapons which enabled the war to end quickly. So at least this is the narrative that we hear. Of course, there is a revisionist literature which argue whether the war could be won even without the use of nuclear weapons, and I don't want to get into that debate because there is a huge literature on this theme. But it's clear that nuclear weapons had a psychological effect on the Japanese, who were numbed into submission. But if you look at the role of nuclear weapons in World War II itself in terms of destruction, it pales in comparison to the total destruction that the World War saw. If you look at it in terms of deaths, there were totally 40 to 50 million deaths from World War II. And the number of people who died from the two atomic bombings are estimated at 300,000. So it is a small fraction of the total deaths. But even if you look in terms of physical destruction, remember that the incendiary the raids that the US Air Force conducted in Tokyo was perhaps even more devastating than the two nuclear weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But nuclear weapons was a new type of weapons which had a psychological impact on the civilian and the military that resulted in quick surrender. The comparison is the kind of damage that a single weapon was able to do in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It took the US thousands of sorties, thousands of airplanes had to conduct air raids to achieve the same kind of effect, firestorms and similar damage. So this is where nuclear weapons entered the scene, and the world woke up to the new reality of having to deal with the completely new class of weapon, the atom bomb. Now let me move on to the next slide. It's a quick picture, the pictorial description of the Hiroshima bomb. It's the bomb which used uranium-235. It was based on a gun design. In fact, this design was used without even testing. So the scientists who designed it were so confident that it would work that they didn't bother to even test. The one that was dropped in Nagasaki was a plutonium bomb, which worked on a different principle. So they had to test it in July to 1945. The Trinity test was actually the tested version of Nagasaki weapon. So the two weapons had important differences. For example, in the case of a uranium weapon, you slam two subcritical pieces of weapons grade uranium to form a critical mass and then achieve an explosive chain reaction. Whereas in the case of plutonium-based implosion device, you have a subcritical amount of plutonium, and then using chemical lenses, high explosives, you compress it to supercritical density and then achieve the explosive chain reaction. So these are the two different, of course, the implosion device is technically more advanced compared to the simple gun design. So these are the two weapons that caused destruction in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Hiroshima bomb had an explosive yield of 15 kilotons, or 15,000 ton equivalent of TNT. And the Nagasaki bomb had an explosive yield of 22 kilotons, or 22,000 tons of TNT equivalent damage. So this is helpful to have in perspective, because the kind of weapons that were developed after the Second World War are hundreds and thousands of times more powerful than the weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So you can consider the Hiroshima bomb and the Nagasaki bomb as a very crude first generation nuclear weapon. Whereas the ones that are deployed in the US, Russia, and other countries are more sophisticated. They are more powerful in terms of destructive impact, and the ability to deliver with high accuracy through missiles and other delivery systems is also very high. As a result, the lethal factor is at least 100 to 1,000 times greater than the first generation device. So this is useful to keep in perspective.
One other point is, one is the weapon itself is more sophisticated and capable of a higher impact, and two is the delivery systems have become more lethal.
Yeah.
The reach and everything. So, of course, which is going to be about forming part of our discussion later.
Yeah.
The arsenal.
If you remember, Arvind, if you remember, the first two weapons were delivered by B-29 bomber. So it was an aircraft-delivered gravity bomb, and its range was about 3,000 kilometer combat. That's the reason why they had to launch it from Tinian, the Marshall Islands. So in order for the B-29 to have the sufficient combat range to drop and then return to the base. But today, remember, there are long-range bombers, which can carry out attack from U.S. homeland and then return back because of in-flight air fuel refueling. So all this has changed the landscape of nuclear conflict, because the delivery systems have greatly improved their range. And today, it's not just the aircraft. We have
missiles.
long-range intercontinental ballistic missiles, which have ranges from 7 to 8,000 to 10,000 kilometers. So that has changed the nature of war compared to the
Toby, if you could, right, can you increase the size of the slide by clicking
Oh,
on
okay. One second.
zooming in? Yeah,
Yeah.
that would be, yep.
So yeah, we will come to that topic after. So another illustrative slide that I would like to show is there are two important materials for making nuclear weapons. One is uranium, and the other one is plutonium. If you take uranium, natural uranium is primarily U-238 isotope, which cannot be directly used for explosives. It is the rare isotope 235 which is required. So it has to be enriched using various technologies, either centrifuges or diffusion plants or laser separation. So the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, uses this classification for categorizing different grades of uranium. Anything which is less than 20% enriched in 235 is called low enriched uranium, or LEU. Power reactors use uranium that is enriched 3 to 5%. So this is the typical enrichment of power reactor fuel, the fuel that is used in reactors that produce electricity. Then you have highly enriched uranium. Anything that is greater than 20% enriched in 235 is highly enriched uranium. And weapons grade uranium is anything greater than 80% 235. So this is useful to keep in mind, because these are terms that you frequently come across in newspapers when reading newspapers, especially relating to proliferation or non-proliferation. Remember that US nuclear naval reactors use 95% enriched fuel or greater for fueling its reactors in submarines and aircraft carriers. So US naval reactors use bomb grade or even higher than bomb grade uranium as fuel. And that's a separate discussion, because the reason is most of the US nuclear submarines use fuel. They have a refueling cycle which ranges from 8 to 12 years. So once they are loaded, they have enough fuel to carry them for sometimes even lifetime. So this is the reason why they go for very high enrichment. Then you have plutonium, which is not found in nature except in trace quantities. And plutonium is primarily produced in reactors as a result of uranium-238 absorption. This is what Fermi achieved in 1942 in the Chicago pile. He tried to achieve a controlled chain reaction, but the objective was not producing electricity, but for producing plutonium, which could be chemically separated from the spent fuel. Again, in plutonium, there are three categories. The weapons grade plutonium is the one that is very highly enriched in 239. So if you leave uranium for too long, then there are other higher isotopes of plutonium which are accumulated, which is a nuisance for a weapons designer, because the higher isotopes of plutonium have premature fissioning property, and as a result of that, weapons production facilities typically have very high uranium-239 enriched plutonium. So, but another point that I would like to make here is bombs can be made from any grade of plutonium, which is why reprocessing facilities often generate proliferation concern, because even though weapons designers would ideally prefer to work with weapons grade plutonium, but it is possible to make weapons from any grade of plutonium, which is why securing plutonium, whether they are in the civilian inventory or in the military inventory, is very critical for preventing proliferation or for preventing theft by unauthorized actors. Then there is also uranium-233, which can be produced from thorium, which is also a weapons usable, but it is uranium-235 and plutonium-239, which are primarily used as materials for making nuclear weapons by US, Russia, and various other nuclear weapon states. This chart, which I took from my former colleague at University of Illinois, Professor Frederick Lamb, gives a very illustration of how much material is required for making a nuclear weapon. For example, if a group has a very high technical sophistication, they can make a 20 kiloton or a Nagasaki type of weapon with just 3 kilograms of um, plutonium, or 5 kilograms of uranium. So essentially, something measuring a tennis ball would be sufficient to make a Hiroshima size or a Nagasaki type of weapons. So this is the role of nuclear weapons until the Second World War. Now let us look at the role nuclear weapons played during the Cold War. For example, the US held nuclear primacy until the USSR tested its first weapon in 1949. Of course, I don't want to get into the espionage case, which is very interesting in its own right. We could have a separate discussion. There were a lot of left-leaning or communist affiliated scientists who were accused of passing nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union, and in fact, a couple was executed. I think it's the Rosenthal. Rosenbergs were executed for their espionage.
Comment there, right? There were, and this is where Einstein also, just to speak on the other side, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, Einstein did write a letter to Roosevelt before the bombing, saying like, you don't have to bomb, just do a demonstration or something. That is the letter which Roosevelt never got to read because he died. And
no, but the thing is, finally, when
he did team up with
in the military, there was always this idea: if it was available, then it would be used to bring an early end to the war. Remember that the Americans had very low appetite for seeing more body bags. Because a full invasion of Japan would have cost at least $500,000 US dollars.
Kojima was practically the factor, but anyway, don't.
Yeah, and it would have cost probably a few more millions of Japanese lives. So this is a prospect that the US wanted to avoid. And used that's the narrative that is at least the Western narrative.
Yeah.
So there was a proposal in the 1940s, which is known as the Burke Plan. It was a US proposal to put all nuclear weapons and facilities under UN control. And not surprisingly, it was rejected by the Soviet Union because they knew that it would give an unfair advantage to the US, so they rejected it. And of course, they tested in 1949. Initially, through the Eisenhower administration, through Truman years and Eisenhower years, the US nuclear weapons delivery system was actually deployed without any coherent plan. So this, the idea of nuclear weapons strategy is based on the doctrine of massive retaliation and strategic bombing that emerged from the Second World War, because the US Air Force was convinced that strategic bombing had greatly helped in bringing the desired military objectives. And so after the Second World War, they latched onto this idea of massive retaliation and strategic bombing. Strategic bombing essentially is, it blurs the distinction between civilian and military target. So you can look at the impact of strategic bombing in Tokyo and in Dresden, where a large number of civilians were killed during all the aerial bombing. But the idea is to break the morale of the society and to numb them into submission.
And one other quick note there on the strategic air, I'm sorry to break your stride, is the name Curtis LeMay,
Yes.
Colonel is key in the Strategic Air Command. He has a colorful personality, and he will play a large role in the Cuban Missile Crisis later. But
Yeah.
he who, professionalized the Strategic Air Command, which had no proper methodology for handling nuclear arsenal, and it is credited to Curtis LeMay for
Mhm.
creating that process and the chain of command and everything within the SAC.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, the SAC was dominating the nuclear arsenal and doctrine through the early 60s. In fact, the movie Doctor Strangelove, you can see that the primary role was played by the SAC, right, for using nuclear weapons. And this changed with the incoming the Kennedy administration, and his defense secretary, Robert McNamara, changed this and emphasized other features like survivable basing, secure command and control. And the SIOP was put in place during that time, the single integrated operational plan for nuclear targeting. And from this emerged the nuclear triad. Until early 1960s, there was only one way to deliver nuclear weapons, that is using long-range bombers. And so, in fact, there was a lot of turf battle that was going on in the U.S. because the army, which was responsible for developing nuclear weapons, was completely sidelined after the war
mhm,
because U.S. Air Force took the responsibility of the nuclear arsenal. And the Navy was also deeply skeptical because they thought this preoccupation with nuclear weapons would cut the funds for aircraft carriers. Because after the Second World War, the U.S. Navy was very keen in establishing a large fleet of aircraft carriers, because during the Second World War, they believed that it was the aircraft carrier fleet which was responsible for securing sea lanes and
mhm.
enabled the US victory in both the Western and the Pacific theater. So they felt that the nuclear weapons, especially the Air Force-led nuclear program, would drive funds for their own initiatives. But with the Kennedy administration and in subsequent years, the US planners realized that it is wise to distribute your assets across platforms rather than in just one particular delivery platform or vehicle, namely the Air Force. So from this emerged a nuclear triad where nuclear weapons were built for different types of platforms and delivery systems. So you had intercontinental range bombers, then you had land-based missiles, ICBMs, and then submarine-launched ballistic missiles. They were all in place, and this is what set the motion for the nuclear arms race during the Cold War. And by the late 60s and 70s, the US and USSR built tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. And finally, they reached a stalemate, which is often summarized by this phrase called mutually assured destruction, or the MAD doctrine. So the idea was neither US nor the USSR could afford to carry out a preemptive strike and escape punitive retaliation. Because this is a kind of advantage that the US had for a while, because the US could have potentially launched a surprise first attack on the Soviet Union and completely clobbered their system and disarmed them. But once you build nuclear weapons in large numbers, even if one party were to carry out the preemptive first strike, they could not be confident that they will be able to destroy 100% of their warhead. So even if there is a residual capacity, even if 5% or 10% is left, that number alone is sufficient to respond with a massive retaliation, which would be unacceptable.
Which is where
So
the doctrine.
yeah, this is where it was. Yeah, this is what resulted in a stalemate during the Second World War because of the numbers. Because both the Soviet Union and the US built tens and thousands of nuclear weapons that neither party could not afford to carry out a first strike and escape a punitive retaliatory second strike. And here, the idea was to distribute your assets in invulnerable platform. For example, if you look at ICBMs or long-range bombers, their locations are precisely known, so they are more vulnerable to first strike. Unlike the submarine-launched, submarine-based nuclear weapons, nuclear submarines that carry nuclear ballistic missiles armed with tipped with nuclear warheads, are constantly on patrol, and so their precise location is difficult to. And so they are relatively less vulnerable compared to land-based ICBMs and bomber fleet. And so, if you look at the U.S. today, I think a major part of the nuclear weapons is actually in the submarine fleet, because they are considered to be more resilient and survivable in the case of a preemptive first strike. So this chart also is illustrative. It tells. It's really crazy. At the peak, the world had about 70,000 nuclear weapons. The Russians and the Americans actually ran out of targets that they began to assign more than 2 or 3 nuclear weapons for the same target. So the bulk of nuclear explosive power at the peak was something like 60,000 megatons. Remember, the Hiroshima yield was 20 kilotons. So roughly 2 to 3 million times more explosive power was residing in the nuclear warheads that were built at the peak of the Cold War. Even though the warhead numbers have substantially declined since the Cold War, but today we are still at around 15,000 nuclear warheads, which is still enough to cause havoc around the world, because 10,000 nuclear weapons is still a large number. 15,000 is still a large number. Now let us come to the last part of my discussion, which is what was the role played by nuclear weapons in the last 30 years, post-Cold War. So with the end of Cold War in 1991, the threat of large-scale nuclear war between US and USSR, involving exchange of hundreds of, even thousands of nuclear weapons, receded, and newer threat emerged. Remember, in the 60s and 70s, both US and USSR had plans to engage in a large-scale nuclear war, which would result in deaths of 50 or 70 million civilian deaths. Essentially, 50% of civilians would be killed in the event of a large-scale nuclear war. And of course, post that scenario, the living would envy the dead. This would be the kind of landscape in a post-war scenario. Thankfully, all that threat receded or practically got eliminated. But newer threats emerged after the Cold War. What are those threats? The foremost was the prospect of theft of nuclear materials and weapons which were scattered in the former Soviet Union republics. So this was a big source of concern for the US. And the US DOE funded a cooperative threat reduction program in the 90s, which greatly helped to secure the nuclear weapons and nuclear usable material during that period. In fact, a lot of enriched uranium that was meant for weapons use was actually blended for civilian use, and they ended up as fuel in US civilian reactors. What an irony! The material that were produced to be used against US ended up as civilian nuclear fuel as part of this initiative in the 90s. But so far we have discussed only the rivalry, the nuclear weapons rivalry and nuclear arms race between the US and the Soviet Union, and the US and the present day Russian Federation, because more than 90% of the nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons usable material are held by these two countries. But there are also other states, China, France, UK, and other de facto nuclear weapon states like India, Pakistan, Israel, and now North Korea. The nuclear tests in 1998 in the subcontinent brought South Asia back to the world's attention. And some Western commentators have frequently described our part of the world as a likely nuclear flashpoint. We'll talk about this in the discussion session. What are the consequences of a nuclear war in South Asia? Then we had the 2006 North Korean nuclear test in 2000, which resulted in destability in East Asia, and its continued buildup of nuclear warheads and missiles pose a threat not just to US but also to its regional rivals such as Japan and South Korea. See, look, Japan and South Korea are non-nuclear weapon states, but they have the technical capability to go nuclear on short notice. So is Taiwan. So there are a lot of uncertainties surrounding, but there is also a question when South Korea or Japan will go nuclear. I have visited Japan a few times and had the opportunity to talk to people in the Japanese establishment, and it looks like there is a very vocal minority within the establishment which prefers to have an independent deterrent. And the Japanese would go nuclear the moment they feel or they lose confidence in the U.S. nuclear guarantee. That's the time when the
Okay,
Japanese.
in
And the last point that I want to make and end this presentation is there are other concerns. For example, nuclear terrorism concerns, the prospects of nuclear weapons or nuclear materials accessed by not state actors but non-state actors like terrorist groups. And this was a big concern that the US had in its justification for its 2003 intervention in Iraq and Libya on WMD concerns. And Iran's continuing difficulties with the West is another source of concern, which is also related to the opacity of Israel's nuclear policy. Because even though Israel doesn't acknowledge its nuclear weapons program, it has probably the most sophisticated nuclear weapons program outside the P5 or the permanent five countries, namely US, Russia, UK, France, and China. So I would end my summary here. I have a few slides which I can use it for illustration when questions come up. But these are the three themes around which I wanted to lay out the discussion. One is the role played by nuclear weapons until the Second World War, and the role played by nuclear weapons during the Cold War, and the role played by nuclear weapons post-Cold War, and it continues through this day, and what nuclear weapons hold for future. Even though the threat of a large nuclear war has resided, remember that the world is still left with about 15,000 nuclear weapons, which are deployed or kept in various states of state of readiness in different countries. And so as long as they continue to exist, they will pose a threat. And there are various arms control initiatives that have, starting from NPT or CTBT or FMCT and START, various arms control initiatives have also tried to address this problem with varying degrees of success. This is also something that we can discuss during the Q&A session. So I will stop here, Aravind, and we'll be happy to take.
Let's take a segue into particularly let's do a couple of two topics, right? One, the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Reagan-Gorbachev summit, and then let's move to the India-Pakistan nuclear rivalry, the Pokhran blast, and then the case of A.Q. Khan and the nuclear market, and therefore, and what are the strategic options? Did creating these nuclear weapons give any significant advantage or safety to India, or has it worsened our policy options? So let's first go to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the real moment when the world came to a nuclear conflict between October 16th and October 29th of 1962. That is when this crisis happened, which is why there is also a very good movie called 13 Days by Kevin Costner. It's a reasonably well-made Hollywood movie. Obviously, being Hollywood, it has a bit of a flavor that favors the Americans, but it does handle the material quite well, without going into all the surrounding causes for the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? Khrushchev had his reason. He was trying to show the Americans that Soviet Russia is not a pushover. They needed to be respected. There's a whole lot of dynamics that happened between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and particularly the Cuban Missile Crisis is when the world came very close to a nuclear confrontation between two powers. And there's a memorable scene in the movie where Dean Acheson, the former Secretary of Defense, talks very nonchalantly, very coolly. Kennedy is asking him, how does this play out? What do we want to do? What do we do? How would the Soviets respond? And Acheson plays the role of a hawk, saying like, "Oh well, we invade Cuba, and then they will strike in Berlin, and then we go to Berlin, and then Kennedy says, okay, and then what?" And then Edison goes, "Hopefully, cooler heads will prevail before then." And later, Kennedy will cite the masterful book by Barbara Tuchman, Guns of August, because that is exactly how the French thought in World War One, that they can do this, Germans would do that, this is how they would oppose it. Essentially, war is when plans come unfold just like that. Your plans are only as good as the first day in a war. So trying to predict how the enemy would react has severe limitations, and which was the point of Tuchman's book, Guns of August. And on the sideline of Cuban Missile Crisis is where China attacked India on 20th October. And the movie also talks about it. What is it with these communist countries that they have against liberal democracies? On one front, Soviet Russia is threatening America, and on another front, China was threatening India. So the world was at a boil for those 13 days, with two democracies being threatened by communist regimes. And it is interesting when you talked about Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense, and he had no defense experience. He was a CEO.
He came from General Motors. I think he was the president of General Motors.
CEO, I think. So he brings certain management perspective to the whole thing. And even during the Vietnam War, he is blamed for a lot of the mismanagement and the technocratic approach, where actually they did this. They fed into a computer saying, here's all that we did, here's what the enemy is doing, and the computer says back, you should have won the war by now. This actually happened. And but coming to the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, that was also the time when both powers realized the limits of having a nuclear warhead, whether it is mutually assured destruction or what. What are your thoughts about the Cuban Missile Crisis?
See, the Cuban Missile Crisis, in fact, the one that I would recommend as even more insightful than the 13 Days, which is a Hollywood version, is Robert McNamara's interview in The Fog of War. I don't know if you...
I have watched that docudrama.
So there, McNamara says that, it was the closest that the world had come to a nuclear catastrophe. In fact, both sides, I think the Soviet Union had taken a step, and then they were looking for a face-saver. So all that the Soviet Union was looking for is a face-saving exit, so that they can take back the nuclear missiles. But it was very clear that the US, conveyed in no uncertain terms that nuclear weapons in their backyard is not acceptable to them at any cost. So it has to be removed. And remember, many years later, Fidel Castro, when some reporter had asked Fidel Castro, did you even foresee the risk? What would have happened if the Russians had used the nukes against?
It would have been Cuba.
Against US without you knowing it. For which Fidel Castro had responded, yes, of course, I knew it was, I didn't have to, because I had given that authority for them to launch in case if things go out of control. So it is not that things would have gone out of control. And, Fidel Castro was very much on board to
Yeah, yeah,
take
yeah.
this
The
to
saying
its
for
logical conclusion, whatever.
this, I will
So,
say.
but thankfully that conflict was avoided, because it is very difficult to, now, with the benefit of hindsight and with a lot of declassified documents which are coming out from the US side, it's very difficult to say whether it would have been contained as a regional nuclear war or as a global nuclear war. So this has always been a big problem. The question is uh, uh, whether when a party initiates a nuclear war with a few nuclear warheads, will the response be with 2 or 3 or 10 or 100? We don't know,
Mm-mm.
right? So this is there is always an unpredictable element of how the conflict would unfold in terms of response. Whether a single nuclear first strike would be responded by another single nuclear first strike, retaliatory strike, or whether it would be responded with 3 or 4. We don't know what's that
I want
number.
that is an excellent point, right? So let us say even between India and Pakistan, and I want to park this question
Hmm.
to the side for a minute, for a few minutes. I want to come back to this topic, right? So let us say India strikes with a first strike with a tactical strike. Will Pakistan respond in a similar fashion or in an escalated fashion? That is the thing. But let's park that question for a few
Hmm.
minutes, because when we are talking about nuclear conflict, we are also talking about the intentional escalations and a war-like situation. We are also forgetting a little bit about what happens about accidental uh, mishaps and accidents at facilities which house these nuclear weapons. And again, there is another movie. I didn't realize this until yesterday, that the movie Broken Arrow, where the words broken arrow refers to a lost nuclear weapon, is actually a term used by the US military.
Hmm.
And Eric Schlosser's Command and Control, I think you recommended that book to me
Yeah.
once. Command and Control particularly addresses that topic of accidents that happen, broken arrow, and this particularly starts with the accident in the Damascus accident, as it is called, where it was a very normal functional error that happened, and
Yeah.
because these weapons are stored in such complex safekeeping, and they couldn't even control what is happening. It was purely God's grace that the nearby nuclear arsenal didn't fire off.
No,
Because
the prospects of accidental nuclear war has been a theme for arms
not just
control
a nuclear
for a
war,
long time.
like yeah, like we on a simpler analogy, right? Take the case of Sivagasi, where we
Mhm.
often hear about fire accidents in a cracker factory. Like that, arsenals which are stored have had accidents. Now,
Mhm.
two questions, right? One, have such accidents happened in India? And what is the transparency in relation to even the American world, as for that matter? So, talk to us a little bit about nuclear arsenals, storage, and accidents that happen in storage facilities of nuclear arsenal.
Yeah. See, there is a classic study by Scott Sagan, who's a
Mhm,
political scientist at Stanford. He has written a very nice book on which essentially lists the number of accidents which had happened in weapons facilities. These are accidents which posed risk to personnel, health risk to personnel, and so on. Then you have, because if you look at the US and Russian arsenal today, and even during the Cold War era, both had deployed them on hair trigger alert, which could be launched on a moment's notice. It just takes 2 or 3 minutes to give the firing orders. Of course, the orders will always be given by the civilian authority who is advised by a nuclear command. There is a very foolproof system, but still, people were concerned about unauthorized launch, because during the Cold War, it was delegate. Some of the weapons, especially the tactical nukes, had received delegation down to the battlefield commander. So
mhm.
this is what US and Russia considered quite destabilizing. And thankfully, one of the outcome of the Reykjavik summit was to completely get rid of these class of weapons, because when you have weapons on the battlefield where the battlefield commander can independently launch it, depending on how he assesses the situation, we are looking into a very dangerous situation of initiating a large scale war because of a tactical war which may be happening
So
on.
on the accidental launch, right? David
Mhm.
Hoffman's Pulitzer-winning book Dead Hand actually gives a very interesting, nuanced portrait of Ronald Reagan, who is
Mm,
often seen in even within U.S. as a hawk and whatnot. Uh, Reagan, particularly after his assassination attempt, he has a certain epiphany about what's going to be his legacy, etc. That's also a life-changing moment for Reagan personally. And Reagan, particularly after the accident where an airline was shot by Soviet military, thinking it is a spy plane. I think it was a Korean Airlines which was flying in, and that incident was a kind of a wake-up signal for Reagan. Reagan
mm,
is like, if this can happen to a passenger airline, what if they start off a nuclear war? So Reagan keeps coming again and again to this question of accidental nuclear war, which is what leads into the Reykjavik summit. And by the time Gorbachev also has problems because Soviet economy is pretty much rotten with it. They
mm,
cannot compete with the US. And he wants to step back from having to spend on all these. Now, let's take a shift because we are already at the 1 hour mark. Let's
mm.
go to the prime moment of India with the Pokhran blast in 97.
98,
Right.
98.
There's a wonderful article by Jaswant Singh in
Yeah.
the Foreign
Yeah.
Policy magazine,
Yeah.
the then External Affairs Minister. And it is interesting for both the tone and some of the contents there. Jaswant Singh, a BJP minister, actually gives credit to Nehru and Indira for a very restrained nuclear policy. And
Mhm.
he lays out, look, these people have preached nuclear disarmament. They did not want to go down the nuclear war route. And yet the international community did not pay heed either to Nehru or to Indira. And here we are today, and we cannot afford anymore to have this nuclear apartheid because they strongly suspect AQ Khan and China. And they said it's time we enter the nuclear club. Nuclear apartheid was a term that Jaswant Singh uses. So take us a bit into the policy decisions then, and
Mm.
let's go from there to what has that Pokhran blast meant for policy in India.
Okay. Yeah, before I come to, I just want to quickly close that discussion on accidental nuclear war,
Sure.
because
Yeah, that's applicable to
even
India.
even 30 years after the end of the Cold War, the chances of an accidental nuclear war is still significant. It's not zero. It has not been eliminated. As long as the US and Russia keeps nuclear weapons in a launch ready status, there will always be a small risk, a residual risk of an accidental launch of nuclear weapons. I think this is a theme that was explored in the movie Strangelove. There,
Mhm.
remember the idea of giving battlefield commanders or even launch officers who are manning submarine launched missiles, is that in the event of a decapitating strike, suppose if the Russians take out the entire political leadership, who will be there to advise,
Mhm.
who will be issuing the launch code? All these things were elaborately discussed in various war fighting strategies, which is why there was always a option for giving authorization or launch code in the event of a complete decapitating strike at the political leadership. So this is the reason why, at some level, military commanders who are entrusted with these nuclear weapons also have, and that is done by various means. For example, you have these PALs, permissive action links, which is a kind of coded system which had to be issued by the political authority, and then it is done by a radio signaling, so that people are not launching it without the required authority. And even if the required authority is not in place, they should be in a position to use them. So all these, the very interesting balance, how to manage nuclear weapons during times of crisis. So this particular thing was actually explored by Bruce Blair, who was Minuteman launch officer, who wrote a famous Brookings study in the 80s. Accident. I think it's titled "The Consequences of Accidental Nuclear War," where he details the risk of an accidental war, which could be launched by either sides because of technical failures or because of the break in the command chain of command, which is responsible for.
There is another interesting component to that, Gopi, my opinion is, and this is strictly my opinion coming off as an outsider, right? And this I had even when I was watching the movie 13 Days. On one side, there is an open democracy. Sure, any democracy on issues of war will have its secrecy, backroom stuff, and everything. And still, there was relative openness from the US side. And then there's the opaqueness from the communist regime of Khrushchev and Soviet Russia. And even with India, that's a problem, right? India is having two neighbors whose political systems are more opaque compared to the Indian political system. So when a civilian leadership in a wartime, even with all our secrecy, which may not still, our openness, India's openness may not rank alongside the Western openness, but still we are a relatively more open society than Pakistan or China. So how the chains of command evolve and what kind of instincts it unleashes once you take the first launch. Right? Always this, when open liberal democracy versus a closed society, when they go to war, there is a whole different calculus that comes in beyond just what each country is capable of militarily.
Yeah, coming closer to home, India never had, India could have gone nuclear a long time back, but it didn't go that route because of strong moral polity considerations. I don't have to elaborate on this. The first generation of Indian leadership were heavily influenced by Gandhian thought, and so there was a moral repugnance towards nuclear weapons, which continued even through Moraji's times. In the late 70s, Moraji wanted to get rid of the nuclear weapons program.
I think
Nehru always vacillated. Nehru, even though by instinct he would have preferred disarmament, he watched helplessly China and other states going nuclear, and so he would have definitely, on realpolitik considerations, would have, if he had survived, say, another 5 or 6 years, he would have definitely given the political green signal to go nuclear. And it took a while. It took a while for India to even get there because one is Indira Gandhi was distracted by internal, she was trying to consolidate her political position in the late 60s, and then riding on the popularity of the Bangladesh war, she never took that as a priority. It was interestingly, I think, within a few years after the Bangladesh war, her political popularity also sunk, and there is a view that in order to shore up a sagging popularity, she used the test as one way to regain her lost political prestige. So this is one particular view that is attached to the 1974 test. But by 1974, time was too late because the NPT had entered into force. So the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, recognizes only 5 states, nuclear weapon states. Of course, it is inherently discriminatory, which India will not sign any time. So India had stuck to this principal position that it will not sign any treaty which is inherently discriminatory and unfair. But despite notwithstanding India's position, most of the world is fine with was fine with that treaty, which is why it had, except for India, Pakistan, and Israel, there was almost a universal compliance. Most of the countries were happy to live with this unequal treaty. And so India was missed the bus. India missed the bus to become a nuclear weapon state recognized by NPT, and so it had to suffer what you call 30 years of sanction. But again, 74 test itself was not, they were unwilling to accept, declare it as a weapons test for various reasons, because there was also a legal reason, because the plutonium that had come for the 1974 test came from the Cyrus reactor, which was supplied by the Canadians. So the Canadian, but they used a particular clause, because in the 50s and 60s, many countries had thought of using nuclear explosives for civil excavation and other works. But there is no difference between explosive use for civil excavation and military use. But in order to avoid a legal embarrassment, India used that clause of PNE, or the peaceful nuclear explosion.
Yeah,
so there was a 24-year what do you call hiatus between the first nuclear test and the second nuclear test. If you let us look at the time period, 98. India was under pressure to sign NPT, and India was also under pressure to sign CTBT, which had come up for future in 1996. And of course, we know how valiantly Ambassador Arundhati Ghosh defended India's case, moral position, and so on. We are very good in defending using moral arguments, but thing is, it doesn't win our case because the entire world had gone in one track, and so India was an outlier state in many ways. And Vajpayee government, again, this is where I would like to highlight the political theory, which was stated. It was not political theory. There was a famous article which was again written by Scott Sagan in the 96 in the journal International Security. He gave three reasons why state go nuclear. One is the national security argument, which is the one that is most explains most of the conduct or behavior of states' desire to acquire nuclear weapons. And then you have domestic politics and bureaucratic politics. And then you have the norms model or prestige, symbolism attached to this. So you can find all these elements in India's nuclear program. There was clearly a security reason after Chinese tested nuclear weapons in '64. There is no way India is going to remain silent with respect to nuclear weapons. So it was a very clear security consideration that was the big driver for India. In fact, Pakistan is less of a concern. In fact, it was the Chinese nuclear program which was a bigger threat. And to some extent, remember in 1971, at the height of the Bangladesh war, the US Navy parked the 7th Fleet in the Bay of Bengal. In fact, that was a threatening gesture. It was loaded with nuclear weapons. And of course, to her credit, Indira Gandhi called the bluff and then did what she did. In fact, the acceleration of India's nuclear program and even in India's nuclear submarine program was actually prompted by the US action in 1971. In fact, many participants in that war have written that this was a defining moment. More than China, it was the US threat in 1971, which resulted in hastening.
That takes us to this particular question that was interesting from a friend that came up.
We'll go to Pakistan's. One is Pakistan's. Pakistan comes much later because India's acquisition of nuclear weapons was mainly to deal with the immediate threat from the Chinese and also to handle the potential long-term threat from the Americans.
So while we have a few other questions, we ourselves are going to address. This particular question was interesting because you were just talking about how it is the deterrence of China that was a bigger driver for India's India going nuclear, and then the US sparking the Seventh Fleet during the 71 war. This is an interesting question that comes up, right? Could India or
Could
Pakistan
India or Pakistan initiate a nuclear attack without the patronage of the
US?
US?
I
See,
think
look, neither US or Russia is not going to egg India or Pakistan to use nuclear weapons in their conflict. So, in the India-Pakistan conflict, if ever nuclear weapons were used, it will be decided by the leaders of these two countries, depending on how the conflict situation unfolds. If you let us examine India and Pakistan, for example.
yeah, yeah.
First time when Pakistan explicitly used a nuclear threat was in '87, right? In Operation, when India conducted Operation Brass Tacks
Operation Brass Tacks, which takes us to the
in '87. In '87, remember in '87, Pakistan didn't have enough nuclear weapons material to make a nuclear bomb, but it had, by then, it had stolen all the technology and the blueprint it wanted to build a nuclear facility. So we still don't know if if in 1987 they really had a weapon that could be used against India. But that's immaterial. If they had technology, then they could do it on short notice, right? In fact, that was conveyed to India because Pakistanis thought that Operation Brass Tacks is actually India's
ruse. It's a
plan
ruse.
to break Pakistan again into two or three. So there was a natural security concern, and for which, remember, after the Bangladesh war, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto realized that there is no way Pakistan would be able to win a conventional war with India because of the asymmetry.
Yeah,
And the only way they could achieve parity with India is nuclear weapons provide this parity in an asymmetric situation. So the idea is Pakistan will never be able to match airplane to airplane in a conventional war against India, because it is.
Few comments around that Operation Brass Tacks. I think we were all in school. We were in the ninth grade at that time. Just then becoming more politically aware. Rajiv Gandhi had taken over, and it was. I remember reading India Today back then, which said Operation Brass Tacks, and General Sundarji, Krishnaswamy Sundarji, was on the cover of India Today magazine, I believe, if I remember correctly. Even Illustrated Weekly at that time ran some issues because it was the first most widely advertised military exercise in Indian history at that point. And the driving force was Sundarji wanted to modernize the Indian army. And it set off such a flashpoint with Pakistan. Incidentally, Dead Hand, right, by David Hoffman deals a little bit with this. The Soviets were always apprehensive about US-led exercisers in European Union. They always thought, wait a minute, these Americans will start it as an exercise. It may come out as a full-blown invasion. So always these military exercises, though nations were supposedly advertising it, though they really supposed to keep channels of communication open, they often felt that somebody could use it and go into a full-blown attack. That was Operation Brass Tacks at that
No,
point.
again, we don't know whether Operation Brass Tacks was actually a war planning to invade Pakistan, but certainly it was to test the operational readiness of the Indian Army for a large engagement, which was directed against Pakistan. And Pakistan naturally had reasons to feel threatened. But again, in this context, I think I read Manishankar Iyer's interview some time back, saying that Rajiv Gandhi was not aware. I don't believe that. Especially a military general mobilizing 300,000 troops without informing the prime minister is not. It doesn't happen in India. I think it was completely
distancing Rajiv from the brinkmanship that happened. Actually, just now my friend was saying that Sundarji.
No. This kind of mobilization, this would have got the green signal.
That was also the time when, as you were alluding to, right, when Pakistan was tipping its finger over or rather revealing its hand over the nuclear weapons, which is the infamous.
Yeah, that was actually signaling. It was a way of Pakistan's signaling
Referring to
that they had nuclear weapons which could be used if India pushes Pakistan to a corner. So this first signaling was done in '87, and through this interview which A.Q. Khan gave to Nayyar. Even that the circumstances surrounding the interview itself is very mysterious, and
yes,
also the reason why Nayyar had to publish it after 3 months after Operation Bastrac is also, it needs a lot of explanation. But if you roll back in time, '87, soon after the defeat, after Pakistan was completely defeated and ended up in two, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto said that only nuclear weapons will save Pakistan in future, and the famous statement, even if Pakistanis had to eat grass, we will do it.
yeah.
This is the motive. And interestingly, the guy who hanged him was the one who continued that legacy. It was under Zia. The nuclear program really got patronage at the highest levels, and by hook or crook, they managed to get the technology, and they also continue to sell it, for money and for missile technology. That's a separate issue that we'll discuss.
And there is an
87 was one instance of signaling. The other instance when the Pakistanis had used the nuclear blackmail was in Kargil, right? So Kargil was the first war that India and Pakistan fought a year after conducting the nuclear test. And if you look at India's own behavior post what we call the realization that Pakistan is a nuclear state, it has been very careful not to escalate. Even though we hear what we call hothead statements from both sides about using nuclear weapons casually. Let me put this way. Pakistan doesn't have the depth in terms of land mass to survive a nuclear war. So India could potentially survive a nuclear first strike from Pakistan, but it could punish Pakistan in a retaliatory strike, which will be end of Pakistan pretty much. If Pakistan launches a strike, they have to just take out two or three cities, which would be end of Pakistan. But again, we forget that all Pakistani cities are also not very far from India. So any weapon detonated in Lahore, remember Lahore is less than 200 kilometers from the Indian border. How are we going to be able to secure the impact of a regional nuclear war? Thing is, which is why a nuclear war in the subcontinent is going to be a disaster for both India and Pakistan. Even if Pakistan ended up taking a larger hit, it is also going to batter India very badly. Even a single nuclear weapon would be sufficient to cause damage that we have never seen in known history, at least.
So that is a great point on which we should probably shift the focus to India versus China, because China, on the other hand, is a much greater land mass, a bigger geography, and a much better rival than Pakistan. And India and China have a very tenuous relationship going back decades, and right now the relationship is practically at its lowest.
I think I have two slides which I want to just show for illustration. One is look at. Can you see? Can you see this screen? Yeah. So for the audience, there is a very interesting resource called Nuke Map, which is maintained by Alex Wellestein, who's a professor at I think he's at Stevens Institute of Technology, not very far from your neighborhood, Arvind. So he maintains a website. This is essentially based on the book written by Glaston in the 50s. So there is a nuclear weapons calculator. So I think this is a Java application where you can choose a city of your choice or a place of your choice and enter the weapon of your choice and then detonate. So here I chose a large Pakistani fission device which was tested in 98, a 45 kiloton fission device. Remember, this results in a casualty of around more than 3 lakh, 3.5 lakh instant deaths, and about 1 million estimated injuries. And a similar number would die over extended periods of time in weeks, months, and years. And if you drop one in Delhi, you can see the impact of 45 kiloton Pakistani bomb. And here is an impact of a 5 megaton Chinese bomb, because the Chinese have a
Larger.
5 megaton warhead in their arsenal. And then you can see the impact it would have, about 6 million deaths. Just a single weapon. A single weapon is capable of providing this kind of damage, which is why nuclear weapons is very unlike, it is a very different class of weapon, which cannot be even used in rhetoric very casually, but we tend to use it in rhetoric.
Can I remove the slide now? Can I remove the slide now so we can move to the
Yeah.
So, sorry. And that raises the question, right? Right now, Taiwan is such a flashpoint, and both the Wall Street Journal and New York Times report that the recent meeting between the Chinese delegation and American delegation, and I think they met in Alaska, it was contentious, to put it mildly. Essentially, they are saying China is no longer playing the nice game or the reluctant game. Earlier, they were very reluctant to even state that we are your rival, whereas now they're telling the Americans, we are your rival and equal, and don't treat us as a second-class power. And they actually got into a verbal, it was unbelievable to read. There was a 16-minute monologue from a member of the Chinese delegation berating the Americans. It was unheard of before. Anyway, it's a new regime. In some ways, if you could think of this, there is a parallel to what Khrushchev was trying to tell America, we are not a second-rate power. This is always the contention that whether it is China or Russia, they had it. Only thing is, China so far was always content to let Americans think what they want, and they were not interested in contesting that. They were not interested in measuring up ego or proving the Americans wrong. Whereas that element has changed, and Taiwan is a big flashpoint now, and nuclear arsenal is hanging there, the hegemony of China. How far, and now if you look at this, one of your discussion points that we had talked about is the Western assessment of South Asia as the nuclear flashpoint in future valid and reasonable? Right. So particularly they look at Pakistan, India, and China, three countries that just cannot get along with each other. All three are armed. And what's your take on the South Asia as a nuclear flashpoint?
Well, I think so far India and Pakistan have conducted themselves responsibly, especially if you look at the wars which were fought between India and Pakistan. They were always fought in the periphery. Civilians have rarely been target of either side. Unlike the world wars, when civilians were considered to be rightful targets in all the campaigns, in the aerial campaigns or all the other Indian wars, Indo-Pakistani wars, and Indo-Chinese wars have always been fought on the frontiers. And so we do not have a historical data point to sort of look at how a future war involving nuclear weapons. Of course, if nuclear weapons enter the conflict, then it will be very different from the previous war. But if conventional wars are any guide, it looks like the Indians and Pakistanis, and even the Chinese, for example, have acted with great restraint in their previous conflicts. And I would like to believe, and I would also argue that all the parties, especially Chinese, not less in the Chinese case, because Chinese don't have to use the nuclear threat with China. Even their conventional, even without using conventional threat, they are able to get away with whatever they want to achieve in India. But if you look at Pakistan, it is very clear that they will continue to use the nuclear threat during conflict. But of course, the Pakistani establishment also knows it would be suicide, especially using nuclear weapons against India would be a suicide. But remember, until now, or even this is something that the late Steve Cohen used to tell in a lighter vein, that both the Indians and Pakistani military generals are westernized elite, and so they would not like to lose the good life that they're enjoying, using army as a cash cow. And so, but what if a substantial part of the establishment is infiltrated by radicalized, non-westernized elite in the armed forces? So this is a fear that the Americans had in the 80s and 90s. For example, remember, more than the threat posed by the former Soviet Union republic nuclear materials that were scattered post-Cold War, they were really worried about the prospect of non-state actors accessing Pakistani nuclear assets. That was a real threat.
Oh, yeah.
And today, remember, I don't want to wish it to become true. If there was an unauthorized use of nuclear weapon by a non-state actor, the most likely source of it will be Pakistan. And that's the day when the Western countries will come to rue about how they have committed an error in indulging Pakistan all these years. So, but again, Pakistan also knows the risk. For example, as long as the nuclear weapons are controlled by the Pakistani military, I doubt if they would let it in an uncontrolled access situation. But in the event of, it will happen. There are some hypothetical scenarios. For example, if Pakistan goes into an anarchy, if there is if it becomes an Afghanistan-like situation, right, where there is no centralized control, then that is a scenario where nuclear weapons and nuclear materials will not just pose threat to just India, but also to the rest of the world. In an anarchic Pakistan is certainly not in the best interest of anyone in the world, because.
And then where I was about to add one more thing, Toby. We need to remember, yesterday or day before yesterday, President Biden has announced a complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan by September 11th. And naturally, a Taliban regime is going to be the government in Afghanistan. How that unfolds, we have to see. But
I think there is one question from Soumya Narayan about NMD.
Missile defense, apparently.
Should I take it?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay. So NMD is a very interesting theme, because if you the godfather of NMD, I would consider the Reagan's Star Wars program. In the 80s, or in the early 80s, President Reagan, this typical Hollywood style, without, he wanted to be heralded as a great hero who made nuclear weapons impotent. He announced that the US would initiate a massive program under Star Wars, or the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. It's colloquially known as the Star Wars program. So the idea is to establish a range of interceptor technologies which would aim at providing active defense against all incoming missiles into the continental US. So this initiative itself is against the letter and spirit of the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, because remember, one of the outcomes of the first SALT, or the arms control negotiation between the US and former Soviet Union, was that they would not deploy any extensive missile defense system. The idea is we keep both ourselves vulnerable to attack. So that is the best way of ensuring each other's safety. So the 1972 ABM treaty limited only I think it limited deployment of 100 interceptors in a single site. So the Soviets decided to defend Moscow, and the Americans decided to defend their missile silos. So they, instead of the civilian population,
Mhm.
even knowing well that it won't work, because this is something that Bush 43 resurrected in a light version. So one of the first thing that Bush did after 9/11 was he was addressing his constituency. He said that uh, the National Missile Defense Program is not aimed at uh, intercepting Chinese or Russian missiles. It is meant for defending the US against the threat of rogue states, who may have a handful of nuclear weapons. But
Yes.
of course, it didn't really convince, or the Russians were not happy with that, because after the US walked out of the uh, uh, ABM treaty in order to support the ballistic missile defense program, the Russians walked out of the arms control agreements, and it also resulted in Russians reneging on other commitments, arms control commitments. So
Yeah.
this was the outcome. But again, if you look at NMD, US NMD, various technical assessments by national academies and independent scientists have convinced that even a simple countermeasure will be easy to defeat a sophisticated defense system. So it is close to impossible to defend against ballistic missile, because you can have a lot of decoys which will be completely
That
overwhelming any interceptor system. So
so
the answer for that, to the question whether India can build an NMD, is the answer is already there, because the US, with all its technical resources and capacity, telling one thing for political audience is one thing, but technically, various academies and technical experts have conducted studies saying that this is not possible. And even the plan by Bush 43 was only against one particular missile threat, that is ballistic missiles. If you look at cruise missiles and submarine launched missile, there's practically no way to defend against them. So the idea of defending against one particular class of missile, which itself is going to be very difficult, has answers for India, because it is impossible. Remember, the flight path between US and Soviet Union is roughly 30 minutes,
mm,
right? Because of the distance. So in the case of India and Pakistan, the flight distance would be less than 10 minutes. So in 10 minutes, you have to do all your crisis management. You have to respond. You have to politically convene. The best thing is not to even go down that path, because the moment you convey that you can build a NMD, even if it is going to be ineffective, the Pakistanis will respond by building more nukes. This is what Russians did.
mm.
Even if it is technically not feasible to build a NMD, it creates the incentive to build more offensive weapons on the other side.
So, what? Yeah, that is a very good place to take a segue into another topic, probably the last one before we wind up, is because the NMD, as you were saying, right? Bush wanted to present it as a defense against rogue states. And now, taking that cue, can you expand a little?
Actually, there's a claim. I think when Bush 43 announced, it was said that this was not NMD was not meant to defend against ballistic missile. It was meant to deflect criticism from political opponents. That's the way it was portrayed in the US.
But
So
anyway, that's a whole complicated, because coming out of
yeah.
11, so many things were moving and the dynamics was complex. But talking about rogue states and rogue actors or a missile, right? Expand a little bit on the popular topic of dirty bombs. That's a term
Hmm.
that often gets thrown around. Dirty bombs. How feasible are they? How much should we fear them? What are your
Well,
thoughts?
a dirty bomb is very much. I would consider it to be more likely than a nuclear weapon detonation, because in the case of a nuclear, whether see there are two different ways in which you can access a proper, what you call, nuclear warhead. One is either stealing it or some state party is willing to give it. And that's not going to happen because anything that is launched will have a return address. So no state is going to risk massive retaliation by providing a ready-made nuclear weapon to a non-state actor. So that possibility is very astronomically remote.
Okay.
But people have talked about dirty bombs. Dirty bomb is essentially a radiological weapon. So there are a lot of
And
what do you
again,
call it? Radioactive isotopes, a lot of radioactive isotopes which are used in medicine industry, which are actually in less secure environment compared to weapons grade uranium or plutonium. So this is what resulted in the concern that facilities, civilian facilities which are handling these radioactive substances need to bolster their security, because in principle it is possible. Say one could imagine a terrorist group accessing medical isotopes and industrial isotopes and then mixing it with chemical explosive and dispersing it in a city center. So it may not result in a nuclear explosion. It will be a chemical explosion that will disperse what you call radioactive material in the vicinity, which would be a nuisance. So it is often called weapons of mass disruption rather than weapons of mass destruction. It won't have the same kind of effect that a typical nuclear weapon would have. A nuclear weapon detonation, whether it is a fission device or a thermonuclear device, it's a completely different class of weapon. I would encourage the audience to go and look at YouTubes, to have a sense of what a nuclear weapon does. There are a lot of declassified footage that is available for viewing. That's very different. Where we are talking about deaths in millions. And areas which will be uninhabited for months or even years before it can be deemed suitable for habitation. All those, and the long term. Even in a nuclear weapon, the military planners consider only the blast effect, which is only 50% of the estimated damage. Roughly 30% of the damage comes from thermal radiation and 15% from the fallout, which military doesn't consider it in its calculation. So if you look at the actual damage, you have to include the fallout, you have to include the long-term impact. And but again, remember, when you are detonating a nuclear weapon, say a 15 or a 20 kiloton or a 1 megaton device on a large city, the weapon damage is not just going to come from the weapon alone. Remember, it is going to result in firestorms. Any city would have inflammable material, fuel. So there will be a compounding effect of a nuclear weapon detonation. But to give an idea, at the instant of detonation, that particular casing will reach 1 million degrees Celsius. And then the mushroom cloud will, result in, damages through blast waves and through prompt radiation and fallout and so on. So all these damages are, very difficult to even fathom. How? In the 60s, a lot of medical doctors conducted fascinating studies, about the medical preparedness of US post-nuclear war. They said that, in a situation when you have 40 or 50 million deaths, the healthcare infrastructure would be completely paralyzed. Nobody would be in a position to respond. So this is where the living would envy the dead, because even though you will have, half of the population who will survive, they won't be in a position to take care of the needs of those who need medical attention or other attention. Your industrial infrastructure would have been destroyed, all the supply system. So the best thing is not to even think about nuclear war, and these are weapons that need to be gotten rid of. But that's a separate discussion. Why we have not succeeded in getting rid of nuclear weapons, and when if they are going to be a constant factor in our existence, then we have to learn how to live with it and how to minimize the risk of accidental war or intentional or unintentional.
So, Gopi, there's an interesting question, right? So we'll not get into this in too much detail because it's a different topic actually. But Seychelles I is raising this question: given the deterrence that nuclear weapons pose, will there be a bigger focus on biological weapons, which is part of the large focus on David Hoffman's book, is about the Soviet Russia, in contravention of what they signed with the US to abolish biological weapons. Soviet Russia literally ran anthrax factories and kept its biological weapons program alive. And there is this incident that Hoffman actually describes. A newly elected Senator Barack Obama, he had just then become a senator from Illinois, and then he is part of a U.S. delegation which goes to Soviet Russia, and or rather, what is Russia now? And they take him to a place where there is actually a manufacturing facility for anthrax. And Obama is looking into an anthrax well. And a fellow Democratic senator said, back when Reagan called the Soviet Empire the evil empire, we liberals berated him for escalation of rhetoric. But in many ways, Reagan was correct. The Soviet regime was a rogue regime when it came to biological weapons, and which was another big thing that we kind of went by, right? The Nunn-Lugar Amendment. When Soviet Russia imploded, and it was America had to step in to save the nuclear arsenal and their biological weapons, and even prevent their scientists from becoming for hire people by rogue regimes. So biological weapons continue to be a concern, of course, I would say. What's your, let's do a quick take from you.
Yeah. See, somehow, interestingly, there is a stigma surrounding both biological weapons and chemical weapons compared to nuclear weapons. So there, because in the Second World War, after the imageries of the scourges of chemical weapons usage and biological weapons, I think the stigma will continue to hold. But again, remember, how do you distinguish from a natural outbreak of epidemic versus an intentional? This is a conspiracy theory that's doing rounds at times like this, right? Where there are still credible claims suggesting that COVID-19 is something that test facility gone wrong and the Chinese were doing cover up. It's very difficult to contest those claims, because in the case of biological warfare, it will take a while to discriminate between a natural outbreak from an intentional outbreak. But that process, this is where India has also indicated that if the country is attacked with chemical or biological weapons, it would also respond with nuclear weapons. So this is a part of India's policy statement that is meant to deter any country that intends to use chemical weapons or biological weapons.
I want to pose one more question on the India, Pakistan, China triangle, reviewing a book called India and the Nuclear Asia, Forces, Doctrine, and Dangers. The authors are Yogesh Joshi and Frank McDonald. The book again is India and Nuclear Asia, Forces, Doctrine, and Dangers. This was reviewed in Foreign Affairs magazine. And the reviewer had this comment to say: the two countries, India and Pakistan, have announced no first use policies, but have left them ambiguous. Pakistan has no such policy. That's true. India stated a no first use, Pakistan has not. And concepts such as minimum deterrence, limited deterrence, credible deterrence, full spectrum deterrence are all tossed about with little clarity on what they mean. So essentially, so much of these terms are used in a fungible manner, right? What is limited deterrence? What is credible deterrence? So they are using all this, and essentially, one country says no first use, the other country says, sorry, I'm not signing on to that pledge.
Hmm.
So coming back to the
No,
first,
even if you look at India, our doctrine is based on what is called credible minimum deterrence.
Mhm.
Soon after, I think the doctrine, the draft nuclear doctrine, was took shape during the Vajpayee government, and I think in 2001. And the phrase "a credible minimum" is very illustrative because it leaves India the flexibility to determine what minimum is. Because minimum is not a static number, so it can change as the environment. For example, based on today's threat perception, there might be a credible minimum. That number might be 200. After 10 years, it might be 500, or even it might reduce to 50. Uh, so this is where I think India's position is. I don't have a reason to doubt on this because India still believes in total disarmament
Mhm.
in a time-bound manner. Because remember, I think we didn't have a chance to discuss the arms control treaties. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 6, was signed in good faith by all non nuclear weapon states because the P5 states agreed to initiate in good faith steps towards elimination of nuclear weapons. So, what has happened in the last 50 years? So, the NPT has been primarily designed to halt horizontal proliferation or the spread of nuclear weapons to more states. So,
Mhm.
it has been very successful in containing the spread of nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons technology to more states. So, NPT has been in fact, NPT provisions have gotten even more stringent to ensure that nobody violates the treaty. But on the part of the nuclear weapon states, vertical proliferation has been increasing, meaning sophistication and range and the quality and quantity of nuclear weapons have increased. So, in a sense, they have reneged on their commitment on which they persuaded all the rest of the world to sign the NPT. So, this is what India complains. That is, unless there is a commitment by the P5 states, namely US, Russia,
Mhm.
UK, France, China, to commit to disarmament in a time bound manner, it will not be interested in signing the NPT treaty. So, if you ask UK, China, and France today, UK's numbers, China's numbers, and French numbers are very low. They are in their hundreds,
Yeah.
less than 300. So their view is let the US and the let the Americans and Russians come to their level, then we'll negotiate a multilateral arms control agreement. So until they come to those numbers, it is not going to happen. And after the end of Cold War, the Russians were not in a position to maintain a very large arsenal
Mhm.
because it was too expensive. It was again the Americans who were roadblocks for deeper cuts. The good thing is we have gotten rid of nearly 80% of the weapons from Cold War levels, but still we are at we have about 15,000 nuclear weapons which are deployed in various states of readiness,
Sure.
and they can be launched on minutes' notice, most of them. But in the case of Chinese nuclear weapons, they are actually not in a ready to deploy, ready to launch status because the warheads are kept separate from. So in that sense, I would say that the Chinese have exercised more restraint compared to British or the French, because they have a very advanced nuclear force which are deployed
But one thing with
on a ready to launch.
one thing with China is how much do we trust what we think we know of China, right? So
Yeah.
they're also an opaque society where what they say to the world outside, what they really are, whether it is their economy or their defense spending or their defense capabilities, China's statements have to be taken with a more than liberal pinch of salt.
No, and of course, I'm not defending Chinese here, but thing is, the Chinese are not going down the Russian path. That's for sure. They're not going. They know that the Cold War race is, it's stupid, and that the Americans had spent close to $6 trillion from 1945 in maintaining this arsenal. Right? It is just the nuclear weapons alone. It's a $6 trillion that was spent on maintaining weapons that will never be used.
The one thing that we didn't touch upon a lot, and you did just now mention, right? The cost of maintaining the arsenals is quite a lot, and I think the U.S. spent like 35 billion last year or something, and India also spent at least a few $10 million on keeping its arsenal upkeep, right? So countries need to realize and balance it against their developmental needs as to how much they can afford to spend on these nuclear arsenals.
Nuclear weapons, they may not be a large fraction of the defense budget. Maybe in the US case, it is not more than 10%, probably less than 10%.
35 billion is a drop in the bucket, really, compared to the US.
Yeah, so in some countries' case, it might also be a more effective way of providing deterrence if they are not willing, or they are not if they do not have the wherewithal to spend in conventional military. So that's a cost-benefit analysis. That's a separate discussion.
But just to round up the conversation, right? Because
I hope. Is there any other question that has been?
Just pretty much everything that we came by, and what I would like to say is, like, basically, we need to move away from a conflict-driven world. Particularly there, as an American speaking for America, I'm happy that we had a change in the presidency from a belligerent, bloviating person who didn't know what he was talking about. At least there are saner elements now. Even back then, there were saner elements holding back rambunctious, loose cannon of a president. But now there is a different presidency, and let's see how the engagement goes, right, between this. So, essentially, nation states need to step back from a conflict-driven approach. And this is where I would say, from looking at it from a geopolitical situation, China is emerging as the biggest threat to world peace. And India, unfortunately, has to deal with China that way. And how that equation shapes up is something to be seen.
Yeah. And nuclear weapons are not going to be a role. It's not going to play any role in India-China relations, the extent it does in the case of India-Pakistan relations, because the Chinese don't consider India as a rival in that sense. They have a very condescending view towards India.
On taking on America, and
the only thing is they might not like India playing the counterweight or being party to all containment initiatives of the US. That is the thing that that it may irk the Chinese, but otherwise they do not consider India to be in their league, and rightly so, because their economy is 5 times ours, and India is not in a position to compete with them militarily or with their nuclear program. So that's and we are in a position to deal with the Pakistani nuclear threat for sure. That's not an issue.
There is hope, and again, not to sound too bleak, right? The world has lived largely, while there are conflicts of a smaller nature around the world, wars have happened. The kind of a world war or a global conflict has not happened for the past more than half a century.
Yeah, one thing that I want to end, Aravind, on this note. I was quite fortunate in being part of a large teaching initiative in the US. I was a teaching assistant for an undergraduate course on nuclear weapons and international security that was taught by Jeremiah Sullivan and Fred Lamb, for 6 years. And then I was also helping my thesis advisor on when he taught a graduate level course on nuclear policy. So in fact, in many ways, even though nuclear weapons is not my primary area of interest, my interest in these issues were, I benefited by this association by teaching or helping the teaching of this undergraduate course and graduate level course when I was at Illinois. And I also taught this course for 10 years in Singapore for a graduate audience. And I've not taught this course for a while, so it was a good opportunity for me to sort of mull over and sort of discuss these issues which I haven't had a chance to talk about for nearly 7 or 8 years. So thank you a lot for
few more hours, but it's a fascinating discussion, right? Because
thanks anyway for providing this opportunity to discuss these issues, which I think it's very relevant. And even though the threat of a large-scale nuclear war is receded, as long as nuclear weapons are deployed, as long as nuclear weapons materials are produced, the residual risk of a nuclear war cannot be completely eliminated. And I think in the interest of world peace and security, countries have to move in the direction to ensure that Article 6 of Non-Proliferation Treaty is followed in letter and spirit, which means the nuclear weapon states will have to put in place steps for a time-bound disarmament of nuclear weapons. And we hope this happens in our lifetime. If it happens, I think it would be great.
Sure. And Gopi, we should take probably this opportunity to announce that maybe a few weeks from now, we both will team up again with another colleague and friend of Gopi on a topic that is of even more importance to India, I would say, which is the educational scene of India, right?
Yes.
Beyond all this, right, because we are talking about nuclear weapons and the military dominance of the US, too often people focus on two things about the US dominance, which is the economic superpower and the military nature of the US. And on whether it is the economy or the military nature, the US far outstrips the second one. That's given. But what people don't often realize is how much the US completely dominates the higher education scene in rankings, the American universities, and what they are to America as a backbone, and why other countries have not been able to create a Harvard or a Yale or a Princeton. China tried it, they failed. China couldn't create a Harvard, and China couldn't create a Yale. And India's university rankings, let's be honest, they are nothing to speak about. So what does India lack when it comes to higher education? What could be done, if at all? And what are the differences? What makes the American universities tick? Can it be replicated elsewhere? We'll have a wider discussion next time with Gopi and his friend with a wider panel, and we'll look forward our friends would join us again.
Yeah, thank you, Aravind. I look forward
thank you.
to join again another interesting discussion.
Sure.
Thank you.